Tom received a presidential pardon. He's from Harrisonburg, Virginia, and has 5 siblings. Tom gets up at 6 a.m. every morning. He's an early bird. Because he's literally a bird. A 51-pound turkey, to be specific. Tom was pardoned instead of the thousands of Americans in prison for marijuana. And this Thanksgiving, the president will pardon yet another turkey instead of those Americans. Visit peoplenotpoultry.com to tell the president to pardon people, not poultry, this Thanksgiving. A message from the Last Prisoner Project.
I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
We're all, in some way or another, trying to make sense of our lives.
That's Dr. Peter Levine, psychotherapist and author, renowned for his work on somatic experiencing, a form of trauma therapy focused on bodily sensations.
In order to really move through the trauma, to transform the trauma, and to heal from the trauma, then that we have to do in the body.
Today we delve into his memoir on Autobiography of Trauma, exploring how both his research and personal journey reveal the body's role in holding trauma and how mindful attention can guide healing.
I think self-examination is important. It's vitally important.
All coming right up. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. Exploring what it means to live a good life sometimes leads me to unexpected places. Recently, a guest recommendation caught our attention: psychotherapist Peter Levine and his memoir, An Autobiography of Trauma. Levine is the creator of somatic experiencing, a therapy focused on connecting with and experiencing emotions in the body. It's an approach which, as best I can tell, insists that we cannot simply think ourselves out of or through the wounds of trauma. Dr. Levine holds a doctorate in medical and biological physics from UC Berkeley and is the recipient of 4 Lifetime Achievement Awards. This book is a raw departure for Levine, profoundly confessional, often uncomfortably transparent, and at moments, well, how shall we say it, mystically inclined, at least enough to prompt this exchange.
One of the people who I had requested for an endorsement for the book, they said, only if you take that part out, because it's too fanciful. Nothing like that could happen. But it did. But it did.
So while I had my own skepticism at play at certain points in the reading, it's hard not to be drawn to Peter's story. And before going further, I should note that Peter's story involves sexual assault, and the interview touches on graphic historical events, including the genocide of Jews by the Nazis in the Holocaust. So listener discretion is advised. But when Peter was a child, his father was called to testify against the mafia. As a means of intimidating the family, Peter was sexually assaulted as a young boy. The memory was buried for years until he sought help from a student to apply his own therapeutic techniques on himself. In this interview, Peter recounts his trauma and healing journey, weaving in, as already noted, some perhaps mystical elements or perhaps just adult active imagination, including vivid dreams and imagined encounters with the deceased Albert Einstein, integral to his development of somatic experiencing. As always, in our explorations, I invite you to take what resonates and leave the rest. One final note: Peter was traveling at the time we taped this interview, speaking from a closed restaurant in a bustling neighborhood in Boston. Here's our conversation with Dr. Peter Levine. Dr. Levine, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward.
Yeah, grateful to have you with us. I wonder, for those who are unfamiliar with somatic experiencing, if we could kind of take several minutes just to begin to kind of give us an introduction to the field and the way this approach that you've developed.
Yeah. Let me give you kind of like an example that might be helpful for some people. You're driving in your car, and all of a sudden you see somebody coming right towards you, and you take a gasp. And if something like that happens over and over again, we stay in that gasp position. So it's something that's going on in the body. And in order to clear it, you have to be able to find a new experience in the body that contradicts that feeling of overwhelm or helplessness. So these are things that happen in the body. And so you have to go to the body to be able to free yourself because the brain doesn't realize that this is not just something that's happened and it's over. It keeps replaying it and replaying it and replaying it. In somatic experiencing, we work with what happens in the body and then how to get unstuck where it's gotten stuck. So I'll give you another example, which might be a little bit more revealing. It's a nice day, and you walk outside your house, and you see somebody has fallen off a bicycle. And it looks like they could be badly hurt. And so our brains recognize injury, and they send the message down to the body, and then the guts twist. Actually, Darwin talked about this nerve, which we now know as the vagus nerve, as being responsible for gut wrench and heartbreak. So again, something like that happens in our body, and then maybe we look more carefully and we see the person is really even more severely injured. And we just go, ah. And it's like all the life is taken out of us. And maybe that night we're laying in bed and we can't sleep. Our guts are still feeling twisted. And at the same time, we have an image that pops into our mind, a type of a flashback of the injury that we saw earlier that day. So again, it involves not just body sensations, but images and also beliefs that we have about certain situations. So while somatic experiencing is a bottom-up process, working with body sensations, body feelings, we also engage top-down processes, which is what's more common in like talk therapies and so forth.
That was the one thing I was going to begin to ask there then. So with talk therapy, the presumption is you begin with the mental cognition or the stories that we're telling in our brain about some given experience, and that may or may not ever kind of engage bodily experience, whereas you're saying begin with bodily experience and then see what that leads us into?
Well, we have to begin wherever the person is. But in order to really move through the trauma, to transform the trauma, and to heal from the trauma, then that we have to do in the body.
I have been in plenty of therapy sessions through the years, but I've not ever worked with a practitioner of somatic experiencing. But it sounds to me from what I've read that your approach, it seems to be a sort of more gentle, easy approach in the sense that you're asking someone to pay attention to what's in their body, which I think could be disarming. I don't know, but does that seem to be an accurate description?
We have to start slowly with that. For example, sometimes I might be working with somebody, a person who's very much in their head. They're really disconnected from their body at all, which is not uncommon. And so I would be talking to them from in their world. And then all of a sudden I might notice something change, something in their body. So somatic experiencing, we do a lot of tracking of the person's experience. And so I might then say, it's interesting, when you were talking about playing with your dog this morning, it seems like your face lit up. I'm just wondering if you were noticing anything about that. And then the person is more interested to reflect. You just mentioned the book that I just finished, the Autobiography of Trauma. I had a childhood, there was a lot of violence, a lot of life threat. And there's a Greek archetype called Chiron. And Chiron translates as the wounded healer. And most, if not all, therapists come also from their own wounds. And so we really need to address our own healing before we can really be with other people in that deep, meaningful, impactful way.
Years earlier, Peter knew it was time to take his own medicine, one might say, engage his own healing, when he started to experience some disturbing bodily sensations and momentary flashes of images which he says he could not grasp onto.
I realized it was time for me to take a dose of my own medicine. So I asked one of my students to sit with me and to be my guide. And in somatic experiencing, we very rarely go right to the trauma. We go, as I mentioned, to an experience that contradicts that of overwhelming helplessness. And so what came up as my guide was guiding me is something that happened when I think it was my fourth birthday, 4 years old.
In the middle of the night, his parents snuck into his bedroom to assemble a brand new toy train set.
When I woke to the train going around under my bed, out into the room. And to say I was exuberant would be an understatement. I literally jumped out of bed and ran over to the transformer so I could control the speed and make the horn go toot toot. And although I didn't have the words for it at the time, that told me that I was cared for, that I was loved.
So recollecting that safe bodily experience of being loved and cared for allowed Peter then to wade into the waters of his own trauma. That trauma had been precipitated by the mafia threatening Peter's father.
Basically, he told my father, my family, my mother, my father, that if my father testified against him, that they would find his family face down in the East River. That was us.
Those threats came to at least partial fruition when the mafia ordered a gang to assault Peter. He was followed one day into the park, beaten, and raped. Now, as an adult, his experience resurfaced through Peter's disturbing bodily sensations.
Being able to shift back and forth, to pendulate, to shuttle back and forth between this experience of being cared for, of being loved, and of being devastated. I was able to do that. And in doing that, I was really able to put that in the past where it belonged and be able to go on in my life. This is a key. It's not just working with trauma, but it's really working with the sense of being cared for, having somebody that cared for us, that loved us.
You have a line in that book, your most recent book, where you say research is me search, which I find very helpful. And even for me, in doing lots of years of academic work, as I would begin to try to think through, why did I do all of the work that I did in some given field? And then trying to integrate that and realize that part of my healing and integration of myself relates to me making sense of why I made all of those decisions. I found that to be a very helpful insight.
We're all, in some way or another, trying to make sense of our lives. And actually, when I started writing the book, the autobiography, I didn't plan to do it as a book at all, because I'm at the age now, I'm in my mid-80s. And so even though I'm a pretty vibrant, healthy person, I clearly have less years in the future than from the moment of conception to where I am right now. I realized it was time to really write my own story. It wasn't to be a book. It was just to find that trajectory in my life. I think it was a Jewish proverb that said something like, "What is truer than truth? Answer the story." And I really believe that we all have our own stories to tell. And that was one of the reasons for writing the book, to encourage people to tell their own stories. And again, I had no plans to make this in a book. I had a very good friend, and she said, "When are you going to publish it as a book?" And I said, "No way. It's too vulnerable. It's too raw. It's too revealing. People would really know some of my deepest secrets." And she said, "Well, I really think that this could help people, help other people." And she encouraged me to just think about it. And I did. I thought about it. And I didn't get anywhere with thinking about it, top down. A number of times in my life, not infrequently, when I feel stuck and I don't really know what my next step might be, I have a dream. And the dream can be important, can be revealing. So during this time, I had the following dream. I'm standing in front of a large field, a large meadow, and I am holding in my hands a whole bunch of papers, like some kind of a manuscript. And I look to the left, and I look to the right, and I look again to the left. And again, I wouldn't say I'm frozen, but I'm stuck. I don't know where to go. And in that moment, this breeze comes from behind me and takes all of these pages into the air out into that meadow to land where they might land. And that is really where it began to be the story. I knew my dream, my unconscious had made the decision. I just didn't know it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Dr. Peter Levine. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be most appreciative if you'd go to your favorite podcast app and write up a glowing 5-star review of No Small Endeavor. Those reviews help extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Peter and I discuss how an encounter he had with Albert Einstein taught him to live with more questions than answers, how trauma may be passed on generationally, and more on the importance of paying attention to the sensations in our bodies.
Listen, we all need advice sometimes. Someone to say, I get it. I've been there too.
But often, it's hard to know where to turn, which is where we come in. I'm Carvel Wallace.
And I'm Courtney Martin. We're both authors and journalists who love finding solutions to problems.
Every week on Slate's How To podcast, a listener comes on our show to receive advice from a world-class expert.
It's like free group therapy, and everyone's invited.
Look for How To from Slate, wherever you listen to podcasts.
There's another passage you quote Rainer Maria Rilke, who writes, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer."
Yeah.
And then you say, I did just that for the next 40 plus years. Unpack some of that for us. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, these were the questions about my life. And as I was saying, I didn't come to answers. I really didn't. I committed myself in writing the book to tell the truth wherever it would take me. So maybe substitute truth for questions, because I didn't know where they would go. But I knew that I had to tell that, to be honest with myself and to be honest with the readers. So again, Rilke, I had teachers who were very, very surprising, you might say. Probably one of the most surprising, maybe to say a little bit about it, was my encounter with Albert Einstein. Talk about questions. Let me go on. So I was at Berkeley. This was in the early 1970s. And I was developing somatic experiencing at the time, but also doing my doctoral work in the medical and biophysics department, and also teaching a class to undergraduates to kind of help pay for my room and board. And I had a favorite restaurant. It's called the Beggar's Banquet. So I would come there, and they were very warm people, kind people, and they would always welcome me and usually seat me in my particular table with 2 chairs. And I would start usually with some bowl of warm soup with French bread, like crunchy on the outside and moist and soft on the inside. And the troubles from that day would just kind of recede. And I kind of like the feeling from the soup gave me that feeling in my belly of warmth. So one evening when I was sitting there, I saw a figure come from the left side, and I realized that this was an image of Albert Einstein. And remember, at that time, I'm a scientist. I'm doing doctoral work. And I know that this man who was wild hair and a crumpled jacket that was 2 or 3 sizes too big for him, but I recognized him as Albert Einstein.
To be clear here, Peter is speaking of an image of Albert Einstein appearing to him in Peter's awakened state.
And so began a year of conversations between Albert and me. Now, again, as a scientist, I know, first of all, Albert Einstein wasn't alive at the time. Second of all, that this was something that I knew wasn't real, but in a way it was real. And Jung talks about active imagination. And this is a kind of a way to bridge conscious and unconscious experiences. And I would ask him questions. Now, getting back to questions, I would ask him questions and he would ask me questions about my questions in the way that Socrates taught his students, the Socratic method of inquiring. And we would do this, many, many, many times, encounters. And at the end, the last encounter that we had, after about a year, was I was noticing that people's traumas were not just things that was happening to them in their lifetime, but was also things that might have happened to their parents, their grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, and their ancestors. And so I asked him about that. And in a dream within a dream, or a dream within an active imagination, he motioned me to come to a pond. And he had a yardstick, a meter stick, with a number of small stones along the length of the yardstick. And he put them over the pond and then twisted in all of the stones, and it came to the water at the same time. And it would make ripples out in all directions, not just forward, but backwards and sideways as well. And then he showed me what happens when 2 of these wave fronts get stuck, everything after that gets distorted in the past, in the present. And I asked him, I said, well, can you tell me how to help people who have had these generational traumas? And he said, and when I talk about this, it does bring tears. He said, Peter, I don't have the answer for that, but you do, and you will. And around that time, I started really developing ways of working with these ancestral, not just traumas, but sometimes very powerful, beautiful transmissions from ancestors. And when we would change something in our own bodily experience, then it would change in our ancestors. Because again, remember, these waves are going out in every direction, forward, sideways, backward. And this man who I was talking to knew something about space-time waves.
Yeah.
About 35 years ago, I was visiting my parents in New York, but I noticed there was a bookshelf above them. And there was one book that stood out, and it was Einstein's theory of relativity. So when I saw the book, my mother, we definitely had a difficult relationship, but she could be quite intuitive. And I told her of what had happened to me, of my encounters with Einstein, my imaginary encounters with Einstein. And she said, they weren't imaginary, Peter. They really happened. And I went, what? I wasn't sure that I was even hearing her. And she said, when I was pregnant with you, your father and I were canoeing on this lake in New Jersey. And a wind squall came and tipped the canoe over. And they tried to right the canoe to get back in, and they couldn't do it. So they certainly would have perished. And of course, I wouldn't be talking with you now because I wouldn't be here. And in that time of life threat, a small sailboat came by with a young woman and an old man, and they pulled my parents to safety and gave them towels to dry off. And they introduced themselves to my parents as Albert Einstein and his stepdaughter. So somehow my mother realized, I mean,
It's so fascinating.
One of the people who I had requested for an endorsement for the book, they said, only if you take that part out, because it's too fanciful. Nothing like that could happen. But it did. But it did.
So this whole notion of generational trauma I find fascinating. And there's one part of me that seems to hear that as intuitively makes a lot of sense. And then there's another kind of rational, irrational, I don't know which it is, part of me that's quite distrustful and saying, I don't know. I guess we're so schooled in notions of individualism, we don't want things like that to be true.
That's right.
But you discussed some research that was done at Emory University Medical School with mice and cherry blossoms that just kind of blew my mind. Would you just describe that?
And mine too. We share that our mind was blown by this research. The way I first discovered this was in, the early 70s. So I was working with a number of people, and there were some people that experienced the smell of burning flesh, and some of them were vegetarians. So it didn't make logical sense. So anyhow, I asked them, because again, I was kind of going along with this idea of generational effects, what they knew about their parents and their grandparents, and even their great-great-parents' lives. And a few of them had ancestors that were in the Holocaust. I mean, that's pretty horrifying. And the fact that they were actually being able to have these smells. Again, I made sure not to talk about it because I reasoned that if I did, people would think I was crazy. How can a smell get passed on from generation to generation? So then some years ago, I came across this very interesting research. In the experiment, they had a group of mice and they exposed them to the scent of cherry blossoms. It certainly wasn't aversive to mice because they would, just smell it and then they would go back to whatever they were doing. Then what we would do is then pair the scent of the cherry blossom with an electric shock to the foot. And the animals would freeze and tremble and defecate and shake to the scent of the cherry blossom. So that's not a surprise. That's a basic Pavlovian conditioned reflex. Conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus. That could have been the end of the experiment, but they took it a step further. They bred these mice for, I think, 5 or 6 generations. And then at the 6th generation, they exposed the great-great-great-grandchildren to the scent, the innocuous scent of cherry blossom. And they shook and trembled and defecate, in many cases, more strongly than had their great-great-great-grandparents done. And this was actually more in the male genome that was passed from males on. So if the males were conditioned, then it was more likely that these generations later will have that same reaction. And it confirmed that from my experience, actually, because with my father, his parents were Holocaust survivors. And it really led me to do some more of my own healing around those issues. And again, using that image of Einstein, of finding the places where these wave fronts got stuck and finding a way to move through and back into coherence and back into flow.
I think the closest I've had in some of my own experience with kind of what I hear you describing, some years ago, I did a number of sessions of EMDR therapy. And the therapist explained, if I understood her correctly, that there's some vagueness and lack of clarity exactly about how that works. But that one theory is that, or hypothesis is that we get stuck in a certain way of dealing with some sort of difficulty. We're kind of stuck in an earlier state of emotional reaction. And by going through EMDR, we can kind of see a new way of looking at it with adult eyes with the help of somebody else, and then have some sort of new way to respond to that. But it is just, I think until that point, I hadn't really considered that, things that have happened so long ago were still so present to me.
The past is not dead. It's not even in the past. William Faulkner.
Yes. Yeah. That it's always with us.
It's always with us.
And that so much then of the life of our the work of our life is to try to find some sort of way to integrate that.
That's right.
I appreciated the ways that you point us toward the work seems not to be somehow to shunt that off and to then ignore it, but somehow to bring it in some sort of way of you're not denying the pain or the trauma, but somehow bring that into one's own integrated self. So you maybe unpack some of that for us?
All the work in somatic experiencing is done in the here and now. So we may reflect backwards, but also we may reflect forwards. The word you use, stuck, is really the key, because we do get stuck, and we get stuck in the nervous system. We get stuck in the body. So the idea in the here and now is to find out where we got stuck and how we can move forward from that stuck place. And again, that's what in my experience has to happen in the body. You know, we believe that we're the captains of our own ships. And like you talked about some therapy you did, we learn that that's somewhat of an illusion. And that people who have done therapy or done self-reflection realize that there are things in their lives that have influenced them. And so what I'm saying is start with that and then shuttle back to things that might have happened in the past to our different ancestors. So to find out where we're stuck, and again, that's something that's in the body. This is really the way we started our discussion. See where it's stuck, and then to be able to move through that stuckness. I can give an example if maybe people want to participate in this.
Please.
But please don't feel that necessary to participate. The example I gave of going out from your door and seeing somebody injured and our guts twisting. Well, when that gets stuck, we continue to replay that trauma as though it's happening in the present, even though it's something that happened in the past. If this becomes more of a chronic feature, you know, we have upset stomachs, we have irritable bowel syndrome kind of things. And so the question is how to help people get out of this stuck place in their guts back into the here and now. And so I played around with many, many different possibilities, particularly with breath and with sounds. So for example, if I ask you to just take an easy, deep breath, and on the exhalation to make the sound woo that's coming from the belly, you're now getting a new stimulus, again, this vagus nerve, the neurogastric nerve of Darwin, that going from brain and body, two-way, but there's even a stronger effect from the body to the brain than from the brain to the body. So in this exercise, if people want to join us, I take an easy full breath, and on the exhalation, I make the sound and vibrate the sound as though it's coming from my belly. So I make the sound and the breath go, ooh, and I let the breath and the sound go all the way, ow, and again, join me if you wish. Then wait for the breath to come in, filling belly and chest. Ooh. Then tell me, what are you noticing right now?
Certainly the release of some of my anxiety.
Release of anxiety.
Yeah. And being present to the moment.
More present. These are typical. Sometimes people will say they feel warmth in their belly or warmth radiating through their body or tingling or vibration. Most of them are positive experiences, but sometimes it might bring up something that was related to a traumatic experience. And then we would work with that. But again, the key here is to switch out of that stuck in the gut, be able to come back into the here and now. So again, that's just one of many, many different, I don't call them techniques, but tools that we utilize in somatic experiencing work.
You quote Professor Julian Flarin saying, quote, "The creative adult is the child that has survived," end quote. And you have this kind of beautiful thread of curiosity and creativity that runs throughout your memoir, and that perhaps the recovery of that as you kind of do all this work on yourself and kind of work through your own traumas. But unpack some of that for us.
Yeah. In the last chapter of the book, the chapter is called Living My Dying. And again, that's kind of taking my steps, my halting steps, to my own mortality. And in doing that, what came up was an image of myself as an 18-month-old child. And this was before some of this horrendous trauma occurred. And in connecting to that child, that was in a way taking me by my hand, taking him by his hand, taking me by his hand, and he by my hand, and going into those final days of my life. And again, we all have that, not just an inner child, but a magical child that lives in us. And I could say that all roads lead to Rome and to creativity and to the creative impulse in all of us and all of our lives. So yeah, that's a great quote. It really is. It really is. One of the things about active imagination, when I did a little research on that, it said that this is something that children exhibit, but no adults do. And I thought, that is totally crazy. As adults, we need that more even than a child. We absolutely need it. But it is something, a child, when they play, you see this imagination, you see their creativity. I actually did not have any children of my own, but I have several godchildren. And I have many memories of playing with them and being astonished by their creativity and grateful that they were sharing that with me.
After a short break, we discuss the link between vulnerability and healing from trauma, the importance and the method of learning to pay attention to the sensations in one's own body, and why self-introspection is worth the work. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. You said earlier that when a friend asked you about when you were going to publish your recollections as a book, you said, no, there's no way. It's too vulnerable and shares too many of my secrets. As you shared that just now, a moment ago, I thought, yeah, I can see me saying the same if I were to try to write a book like this, and that you're so vulnerable about the traumas you experienced, and you're so vulnerable about even the way in which those traumas then led you to have to do a lot of work in making sense of integrating your own sexuality and your own sexual experiences through your life. Any further commentary on that or anything you want to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is very vulnerable. And what my friend said, which I took to heart, and that's, I think, why the dream came up. She said, Peter, I think if you write this book, you'll be helping other people write their own stories. They may not choose to publish them, but they can, again, write the stories, look at the trajectory of their lives, be able to form a more coherent narrative. And I think I took that to heart, her advisement. And it was difficult. It was really, really, really difficult. The first time I spoke about this in public, there's a conference called The Evolution of Psychotherapy, and they usually have, like 4,000 to 8,000 people attending. So I was standing in front of this audience, and the title of my talk was An Autobiography of Trauma. And my throat constricted and caught. And the words wouldn't come out. But then I remembered I actually had lunch earlier that day with a couple of my colleagues who were also presenting at this conference, and how much they supported me in writing their comments about the book. And so I could feel them by my side and behind me, having my back. And then the words just came. So again, that support, even as adults, we really need it from others and from other people who care about us and who we care about them. I think, again, having those people in my life has made a world of difference.
Yeah, that encouragement you heard from them of be scared, but keep going, right? Keep leaning in. I think the notion of courage that's needed for all of us to face our own stuff is just crucial. That made me flash back to one of these seasons of therapy. I remember I was one of the folks who you alluded to earlier, in their head, completely unaware of their emotions and feelings and their body. As a matter of fact, in one of the early sessions, he said to me, "What are you feeling?" And I said, "I don't know." And he smiled and he said, "I think you're telling the truth."
Oh, that's cute. Yeah. I like that.
But one of the things that he said, I think in the very first session, was he said, "This may be one of the hardest things you've ever done." And when he said that, I kind of dismissed it. I thought, "Oh, that's just psychotherapist babble, you know." But then in time, I realized, no, it really was. It was one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And so what kind of encouragement would you give, encouragement to courage would you give to people who are listening and they suspect there might be some way in which they are stuck?
Let me give you another exercise that your audience can do if they want. So again, if starting with somebody who doesn't have any sense of their body, again, your therapist is exactly the right thing to you. So I'll say, okay, so just look at your hand. Are they more open or are they more closed? So if they're more open, look at them as they open more. And then look at them as they close and close more. And then look at them again as they open. Now, not just looking at them, but actually putting your mind in your hands, feeling the sensations in your hands. And they just notice what happens when you slowly contract your hands into a fist, and then slowly, gradually opening your hands and opening your hands. And when your hands are open, again, just sense them, feel them as much as you can. Tension, position, vibration, anything. And then just letting them close again into a fist. And as you have feeling them in your fist, maybe notice if there's some sense of strength or power or even anger in your fist. And whatever it is, just sense it physically. And then when you've done that, then again, just slowly, slowly open your hands, feeling the sensation of the hands becoming open. And maybe the sense of reaching for something with the open hands, maybe reaching for something. And maybe it's something you really want for yourself. If it is, then taking that and then bringing it here into your chest and into your heart. And I don't think I've ever worked with somebody, no matter how disconnected they are with their sensations and feelings, that doing this will at least evoke the beginning of that and take a place. Because once people get that sense, they really go with it.
In just the last few moments we have here, a couple of finishing questions. One, we've talked about the need for courage to step into these places where we might be stuck and to work on our stuff. And at the same time, I wonder sometimes, where's the line, you think, between a courageous examination of one's traumas, a courageous willingness to do work on oneself on the one hand, and a sort of indulgent self-introspection or navel gazing on the other side? What's the health there?
Yeah. Oh, man. Wow. That's a beautiful question. We'll have to do another interview later. I mean, we all have our shadow sides. I mean, definitely it took courage for me to do this excavation and to write this book. But in all honesty, I think there's some small amount of self-indulgence. But I think it's like maybe 2 to 4% compared to the courage, which was the great majority. But I think, and thank you for bringing me to task on that. I think it's something that I do need to acknowledge, that there was some element of that, but it was not the dominating force.
Yeah, I certainly don't raise the question as calling you to task because I didn't detect it there. But as I have grown more aware myself, as I learned years ago to start paying attention to my own emotions and my own emotional state and the way in which I would not allow myself to feel deeply sad when I really should feel deeply sad about things I was processing. Then I started realizing there was the tendency that if I began to acknowledge my sadness, the place I could be tempted to go to or seem drawn to sometimes was to go over into self-pity, which didn't serve me well. Acknowledging my sadness served me well, but that became a space in which I could find myself falling prey to self-pity. So it seems like so many of these things, it's a sort of new way of learning to be, and then it brings with it its own sort of potential additional pitfalls or other things we could fall into. So commentary or thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, let me give you kind of an example. Sometimes when I'm working with somebody, especially somebody, who's very cut off from their feelings and their sensations, and I notice the beginning of a tear forming. Instead of saying, well, what are you feeling in your body? I might say something. If you let your tears speak, if you let them speak, not you, not this part, but if you let your tears speak, what might your tears want to say? And usually that helps people get into a much deeper connection with their feelings and their sensations, letting them speak, letting the tears speak.
Yeah, that made me flash back to a moment in a session where my tears were flowing and I immediately moved to wipe them away.
Uh-huh.
And I was encouraged to let them just run down my face. And
yes, exactly.
Instead of trying to let them be put away so quickly. As kind of a closing word, as you've done this work on this kind of vulnerable gift of sharing your own experience and your own way that has led you to do the work that you've done with your life, maybe one or two words of encouragement or one or two words of possibility of things that from your own experience you would say, consider these things as you continue to look at yourself, as you continue to find your own way forward. That might be a helpful place for us to end.
Yeah, I think self-examination is important. It's vitally important to take it where it will take you, to know that we may have very smart conscious minds, but we have an unconscious mind, as Jung talked about, that's very much wiser than the conscious mind. And I would suggest to follow that mind and see where that mind takes you. And I think we have an instinct to heal, an instinct to come to wholeness. And again, I think that was what prompted me in writing the autobiography and in working on the book I'm working on right now, which is called Trauma and Spirituality, Resilience and the Human Spirit. It is about connecting to that spirit, that spiritual part of ourselves. And we all have different ways to do that. And so again, I just encourage you all to find your way to walk tall. This is the Navajo chant, to walk tall and walk in beauty. Mm-hmm. And thank you for the discussion today. It was lovely.
Been talking to Dr. Peter Levine, developer of Somatic Experiencing, about his most recent memoir, An Autobiography of Trauma. Peter, thanks so much. It's been a delight to talk to you and grateful for your time. Thank you. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with psychologist and author Peter Levine about his recent book, An Autobiography of Trauma. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriette Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.